The storm came down over Thornbury Hollow like something with a grudge, and it was in the thick of it, with the rain hammering sideways and the wind tearing leaves from the old elms, that Wren Hollis found the stranger lying half in the ditch along the lower lane, one hand pressed to his chest, and the other, the ruined one, held stiff and wrong against his side. She almost walked past him. God forgive her, she almost did, because the lane was dark, and her basket was heavy with the herbs she had gathered before the sky broke open, and she had learned, over 3 hard years of nursing her father through his failing lungs, that a woman alone on a country road after dark did well to keep walking. But then lightning cracked white across the fields, and in that instant she saw his face, pale as bone, jaw clenched against pain he was clearly trying very hard not to show, and something in her chest simply would not let her leave him there. "You're bleeding," she said, crouching beside him, and he opened his eyes, grey, sharp, startlingly aware for a man who looked half drowned, and studied her for a long moment before he answered. "Astute," he said, and even through his pain there was a dry thread of humour in it that surprised her. She did not laugh. She was too busy noting the gash across his palm, deep and ugly, the blood diluted pink by rain, and already slowing in a way that told her he had been lying there longer than was safe. "Can you walk?" "I have walked worse distances with worse wounds." "That isn't an answer." He looked at her again, and something shifted in his expression. Some flicker of surprise, as if he had expected her to flatter or fuss, rather than press him plainly. "Yes," he said. "I can walk." She helped him up anyway, his good arm slung over her shoulders, and he was heavier than his lean frame suggested, solid with a strength that spoke of a life not entirely spent behind a desk. Though his hands, she noticed even in the dark and the rain, were not the hands of a labourer either. Too clean beneath the blood, too unmarked by years of honest work. She filed the thought away and did not speak it, because a woman learned, in villages like Thornbury Hollow, that some questions were better left unasked of strangers who arrived in storms with wounds they did not explain. By the time they reached her cottage at the edge of the hollow, the rain had soaked through both their clothes, and he was leaning on her more than he likely wished to admit. She sat him at the table near the low fire, lit 2 more candles despite the expense, and set about cleaning the wound with the brisk, unhurried competence of a woman who had bandaged far worse. He watched her the entire time, silent, his grey eyes following her hands as she worked, and there was something unnerving in the intensity of his attention, as though he were memorizing her rather than simply enduring her care. "You're very quiet," she said at last, threading a clean strip of linen through her fingers. For a man who was quick enough with words on the road. "I am considering," he said, "whether to thank you or to warn you that helping strangers in storms is a poor habit for a woman living alone." "I live with my father," she said, "though he sleeps like the dead most nights now. And I have bandaged worse than your hand, sir, so you needn't trouble yourself over my habits." She tied off the linen and sat back. "There. It will need changing daily, and you'll want to keep it dry, which I imagine will be difficult if you intend to go on wandering about in storms." "I don't intend it as a habit," he said, and something in his voice, some careful flatness, told her there was more beneath the words than he meant to share. "I find myself between destinations at present. A travelling man with no destination, and a hand that looks as though someone meant to do him real harm." She kept her tone light, but she watched him as she said it, and saw the faint tightening at the corner of his jaw before he smoothed it away. "An accident," he said. "Nothing more interesting than clumsiness with a blade." She did not believe him. She had cleaned enough wounds to know the difference between the ragged tear of an accident and the clean, deliberate line of a blade meant to threaten rather than kill. A warning cut, the kind a man gave when he wanted another man afraid rather than dead. But she said nothing more of it that night, only fetched him a blanket and let him sleep by the fire, and lay awake herself a long while. listening to the storm ease outside her window and wondering, with an unease she could not quite name, who exactly she had brought into her home. In the morning he was gone before she woke, and for one strange hollow moment she felt something that was almost disappointment, before she told herself firmly that it was relief. That a woman in her position could not afford strange men with unexplained wounds lingering about her cottage, however unsettling his eyes had been, however oddly gentle his gratitude. But he had left something on the table. A single coin, more silver than she had held in her hand in a year, and beneath it, weighted down, a folded scrap of paper with 4 words written in a hand too fine. Too educated. For a common traveller. For your trouble. Gabriel, she stared at the coin for a long moment, turning it over in her fingers, and told herself it was only payment, only the ordinary courtesy of a man who did not wish to be a burden. She told herself this several times before she believed it even a little. She did not see him again for 11 days. And in that time her world went on exactly as it always had. Which was to say, badly. Her father's cough had worsened through the wet spring, and the apothecary in the next village charged more for his tinctures than Wren could easily spare. So she had taken, these past months, to gathering her own herbs along the hedgerows, and brewing what remedies she could remember from her mother's old receipts before her mother had died and left her, at 19, the sole keeper of a failing household and an ailing man. It was not a life she had chosen, precisely, but it was the one she had, and she had learned not to waste time mourning the one she might have had instead. The debt was the worst of it. Squire Pruitt held the note on their cottage, a debt her father had taken on 2 winters past, when the roof needed mending and there had been no other way. And the squire was not a patient man, nor a kind one, and he had made it plain, more than once, exactly how the debt might be forgiven if Wren would only consent to marry his son Edmund. Edmund Pruitt was neither cruel nor clever, but he was loud and careless, and looked at Wren the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he has already decided to purchase, and the thought of binding herself to him for the rest of her life made something in her chest go cold and small every time the squire raised the subject, which he did with increasing frequency as the debt came due. "You'll not do better," her Aunt Prudence told her flatly, on one of her visits, the older woman settling into the good chair by the fire with the particular satisfaction of someone delivering unwelcome truths. Prudence was her father's sister, widowed and sharp-tongued, and entirely without illusions about Wren's prospects. A plain girl with no dowry, and a sick father and a cottage mortgage to the eaves, does not have the luxury of waiting for something better than Edmund Pruitt, Wren, and you know it as well as I do. "I know it," Wren said, because there was no point arguing with the truth, however much she disliked its shape. "I simply have not yet resigned myself to it." "Resignation," said Prudence, "is a skill, like any other. You would do well to learn it before the squire loses his patience entirely." It was 3 days after this conversation that Gabriel returned, and this time he did not arrive bleeding in a storm, but walked up the lane in ordinary daylight, in clothes that were plain but well made, his injured hand still bandaged though healing. And he stood at her garden gate with an expression she could not quite read. "I find I did not thank you properly," he said, "for the night of the storm." "You left a coin," she said, "which I took to be thanks enough." "Coin is not thanks. Coin is payment. There is a difference, though I imagine you already know that better than I do." She studied him, this odd, quiet man with his careful speech and his 2 clean hands, and his eyes that seemed always to be watching for something beyond what was in front of him. "What is it you want, sir?" "Work," he said, and the word seemed to cost him something, though she could not have said what. "I understand you keep a garden larger than you can easily manage alone, and I find myself, as I said, between destinations. I would offer my labor in exchange for lodging, if you have need of an extra pair of hands. and if you can tolerate a man who asks few questions and answers fewer. It was, on its face, an absurd proposal, a strange man appearing at her gate, asking to work for board, and every sensible instinct told her to refuse it. But she looked at his hands, at the calluses that were beginning to show now that she looked closer, calluses that had not been there the night of the storm, as though he had spent the 11 days since doing labor he was not accustomed to. And she thought of the garden gone to seed, because her father could no longer help her tend it. And she thought too, though she would not have admitted it aloud, of the strange, quiet comfort she had felt watching him sleep by her fire, and something in her decided before her sense had finished arguing against it. "You'll sleep in the shed," she said, "and you'll eat what we eat, which is not much, and you'll not ask me questions about my father's health that I do not wish to answer. And in return I will not ask you why a man with hands like a gentleman's is bleeding in ditches and offering himself as a laborer to strangers." Something flickered across his face, surprise, and beneath it something warmer that he did not quite let reach his mouth. "A fair bargain," he said. "I accept it." He was, she discovered over the following weeks, an unexpectedly good worker. Though clumsy in the particular way of a man learning tasks his body had never been asked to perform before, he split kindling awkwardly at first, blistered his hands badly enough that she had to bandage them alongside his healing palm, and once managed to nearly upend an entire barrow of manure over his own boots, a sight that made her laugh aloud for the first time in longer than she could. Remember, he took the laughter well, better than she expected, grinning at his own ruined boots with a rueful good humor that seemed at odds with the guarded stillness he wore the rest of the time, as though laughter were a door he only occasionally allowed to open. "You're not accustomed to this sort of work," she said one evening, watching him rub liniment into his blistered palms with more care than skill. "No," he admitted. "I confess I am not. What were you accustomed to before?" He was quiet a long moment, and she thought he would refuse to answer, as he so often did when her questions strayed too near the truth of him. But instead he said, slowly, "Managing things. Land, mostly, accounts, tenants, disputes over boundary walls and grazing rights. It is not so different from this, in its way, only I did it with a pen rather than a spade, and from a considerable distance. That sounds a great deal grander than splitting kindling." "It sounds grander," he agreed, "but I confess I have found more honest satisfaction in this fortnight of splitting kindling than I found in a decade of managing land from a distance. There is something to be said for work you can see the shape of. A split log, a weeded row, a wound that closes." His grey eyes lifted to hers, and there was something in them that made her breath catch, something that felt almost like gratitude, though for what she could not have said. "I had forgotten that, I think." It took losing everything familiar to remember it. She wanted, badly, to ask what he meant by losing everything familiar, what had driven a man of clear education and clearer breeding to a ditch in a storm with a blade wound and no explanation. But she had promised not to ask, and some instinct told her that if she pressed too hard, he would simply vanish again as he had after the storm. And she found, to her own quiet alarm, that she did not want him to vanish. Not yet. Perhaps not at all. The village noticed him too, of course, because villages notice everything, and within a fortnight there was hardly a soul in Thornbury Hollow who had not formed some opinion about the strange man labouring in the Hollis garden. The blacksmith's wife thought him a runaway debtor. The miller's boy was convinced he was a highwayman gone respectable. Old Mrs. Feathers at the churchyard gate, who saw omens in everything, declared he had the look of a man running from something far graver than debt, and though her neighbours laughed at her for it, Wren, hearing the remark second-hand, felt an uncomfortable chill settle over her, because some part of her had begun to suspect the very same thing. It was Prudence who voiced the danger plainest. Arriving one afternoon, with her mouth already set in its most disapproving line before she had even crossed the threshold. "You cannot keep a strange man sleeping in your shed, Wren, whatever labor he trades for it. People are talking. A woman's reputation is the one thing poverty cannot touch, and you are spending yours as carelessly as if it cost nothing at all. He sleeps in the shed, aunt, not the house, and my father is beneath this roof every hour of every day. Your father is an invalid who cannot chaperone a mouse, and you know it as well as I do. I am not accusing you of impropriety, child. I am warning you that accusation requires no truth behind it to do its damage. Send him on his way before the damage is done." Wren did not send him away, though the warning lodged itself uncomfortably in her chest, and she found herself, in the days that followed, watching the villagers' glances a little more closely, hearing the pause in conversation when she passed the well, and understanding, with a growing unease, that Prudence's warning had not been idle. Reputation, once questioned, rarely recovered its full shape, and she was gambling hers on a man whose true name she still did not know. She might have sent him away then, might have found the courage to do the sensible thing, if not for the evening, not long after, when her father took a turn for the worse. It happened suddenly, as such things did with his illness. A fit of coughing that would not ease, his lips going faintly blue in the candlelight, while Wren knelt beside his bed, with her own hands shaking too badly to be of much use. It was Gabriel who kept his head, who propped the old man upright and coaxed steam from a kettle of boiling water and herbs, who spoke to him in a low, steady voice through the worst of it, calm and certain in a way that settled Wren's own panic simply by being near it. By the time the fit passed and her father slept again, exhausted but breathing easier, the eastern sky had begun to grey toward morning, and Wren found herself sitting on the cottage step beside Gabriel, both of them hollowed out with the particular exhaustion that follows fear. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I do not think I could have managed that alone." "You would have managed," he said. "You manage everything alone, Wren, far more than any one person should have to. I only happened to be here to share the weight of it this once." "You keep happening to be here," she said, "for a man who claims to be only passing through." He was quiet a long moment, watching the sky lighten over the hedgerows, and when he spoke again his voice had a rawness to it she had not heard before. "I have not told you the truth of why I came to be bleeding in your ditch, and I find, sitting here, that the not telling has begun to feel less like protection and more like theft, because you have given me every honest thing you have to give, your care, your labor, your father's trust, your own good name risked before a village quick to judge, and I have given you nothing in return but a false name and careful silence." Her heart beat hard against her ribs. "Then tell me." "I want to," he said, and it was the first time she had heard him admit to wanting something so plainly. "More than you know. But I am afraid, Wren, of what the truth will cost, and I find myself, for the first time in longer than I can remember, more afraid of losing something than I am of any blade in any ditch." He turned to look at her then, and in the grey, uncertain light before dawn, something passed between them that felt, to Wren, dangerously close to a confession neither of them was yet brave enough to finish. "Grant me a little more time," he said softly. "Please, I will tell you everything, I swear it. But let me be simply Gabriel a while longer, with you, before the rest of the world remembers who else I am." She should have pressed him. She knew it even then, some sensible corner of her mind, insisting that a woman risking her reputation and her heart in equal measure deserved better than more careful silence. But she looked at his face in the greying light, tired and open and achingly sincere, and found she could not bring herself to take back the safety she had just watched him give her father. And so she nodded instead, and let the moment pass unfinished, a decision she would turn over in her mind many times in the weeks that followed, wondering whether kindness had made her wise or simply blind. Her father liked him, which surprised her more than anything else. Thomas Hollis had grown suspicious and short-tempered in his illness, quick to distrust strangers, but he took to Gabriel with an ease that seemed almost instinctive. The two of them sitting by the fire some evenings, while Gabriel read aloud from the few books the cottage possessed, his voice low and steady, pausing now and then to discuss a passage with a thoughtfulness that spoke of genuine education rather than mere literacy. "That man has been to university," her father said to her once, when Gabriel had gone out to check the hens. "Mark me, Wren no common labourer discusses Aristotle with that kind of ease." "He says he managed land," Wren said. "Perhaps he was a steward, or an educated clerk of some kind." "Perhaps," her father said, though his tone made clear he did not believe it, and neither, in her private heart, did she. The truth of it was that the longer Gabriel stayed, the less sense his presence made, and the more her heart, traitorously, ceased to care about the sense of it at all. He was awkward with physical labour, but sharp as a blade in conversation, quoting poetry one moment and discussing crop rotation with real understanding the next. He deferred to no one in the village, not even to Squire Pruitt, who rode past the cottage one afternoon and looked at Gabriel with the particular narrow-eyed suspicion he reserved for anyone he could not immediately place in the proper order of things, and Gabriel had met his gaze with a level, unbothered calm that made the squire of all people look away first. "You ought to be more careful," Wren warned him that evening. "Squire Pruitt is not a man to cross. He holds the note on this cottage, and he has made it plain he'd forgive the debt entirely if I married his son. And I do not think he takes kindly to strange men lingering about the woman he means to have for a daughter." Something dark passed over Gabriel's face at that, quick and gone before she could name it. "He means to buy you," he said, "with your father's debt. He means to have his son settled with a wife who will manage his household well and cause him no trouble, and I am, by his reckoning, a suitable candidate, being poor enough to have no other choice, and sensible enough not to embarrass him." She said it without self-pity, because self-pity was a luxury she had long ago decided she could not afford. But she saw something flicker across Gabriel's face that looked unmistakably like anger on her behalf. "You deserve better than to be purchased like a length of cloth," he said, low and fierce, and then, as if he had said more than he intended, he looked away toward the fire, his jaw tight. "Deserving and having are not always the same thing," she said quietly. "I learnt that a long time ago." "Then perhaps," he said, so softly she almost missed it, "it is time someone taught you differently." She did not know what to say to that, and neither, it seemed, did he, and they sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable so much as charged, full of things neither of them was yet brave enough to say aloud, and it was in that silence, that quiet, dangerous, growing silence, that Wren understood with sudden clarity that she was in a great deal of trouble, because whatever Gabriel was, whoever he truly was beneath the borrowed clothes and the careful evasions, she had begun, somewhere in these past weeks, to fall in love with him. The realization frightened her more than the storm had. It was another fortnight before the first real crack appeared in the careful world they had built, and it came, as such things so often do, from the outside. Wren had gone to the village on an errand, to collect a parcel of thread from the draper's shop, and it was there, in the small, crowded space of the shop, that she overheard two men speaking in low, urgent voices near the door. Men she did not recognize, dressed too finely for Thornbury Hollow, their horses tied outside bearing a crest she did not know, but noted, out of habit, the way she noted everything. Last seen in this county, the innkeeper at Bexley swore to it, a man matching the description, wounded hand and all. His lordship's uncle will not be pleased if we return empty-handed a second time. The old earl's health fails daily, and if the Viscount is not found and returned before the reading of the will, keep your voice down, fool. This is not the place. Wren stood very still amid the bolts of cloth and ribbon, Her heart suddenly loud in her ears, and told herself it meant nothing. That viscounts and wounded hands and urgent men on fine horses had nothing whatever to do with the quiet man splitting kindling in her shed. She told herself this the entire walk home, and found she believed it less with every step. She did not mention it to Gabriel that evening. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, though in her private heart she knew she was simply afraid of what the wrong moment might reveal, and so she watched him instead, watched the careful way he moved through the cottage, the education in his speech, the calluses that did not quite match the rest of him, the wound on his hand that a blade had made with deliberate, threatening precision, and piece by piece, the picture assembled itself in her mind whether she wished it to or not. 3 days later, the men returned to the village, and this time they did not stay near the draper's shop, but rode out along the lower lane, toward the hollow, toward her cottage, and Wren, working in the garden with Gabriel at her side, saw them coming while they were still some distance off, and felt the blood drain from her face. "Gabriel," she said, low and urgent, "there are men on the road. Fine horses. I heard talk of them in the village 3 days past, men searching for a wounded viscount, and I did not want to believe." He went very still beside her, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders, and in that stillness she saw the truth confirmed as surely as if he had spoken it aloud. "Go inside," he said quietly. "Please, Wren, whatever happens, go inside and stay there. Tell me who you are," she said, and her voice shook despite her effort to steady it. "Tell me now, before they arrive, because I would rather hear it from you than from strangers on the road." He turned to face her fully then, and for the first time since the night of the storm, she saw something in his expression that looked almost like surrender. "My name is Gabriel Ashworth," he said, "Viscount Ashworth, though I have gone by plainer names these past weeks, for reasons I will explain if you will grant me the chance. I did not lie to you about who I am in this cottage, in this garden. With you that man was real, Wren, every word of him. I lied only about the title I left behind, and I did so because the title itself had become a hunting ground, and I did not know, when I first stumbled into your ditch bleeding, whether the hand that held the blade belonged to someone close enough to find me again." The riders were nearly at the gate now, and Wren felt something cold and vast open up inside her chest. Not quite betrayal, not yet, but the sick, dizzying edge of it. The understanding that the man she had bandaged and fed, and slowly, foolishly, hopelessly given her heart to, was not the man she had believed him to be, was instead a lord, a viscount, a creature from a world so far above her own, that the very idea of him kneeling in her garden with dirt beneath his fingernails now seemed like some elaborate, cruel joke the universe had played at her expense. "A viscount," she said, and her voice came out flatter than she intended. Flat, with the effort of holding back everything trying to break loose beneath it. "You let me bandage a viscount's hand, and thought nothing of telling him the truth of Squire Pruitt's designs on me. Thought nothing of letting me speak so plainly, so foolishly, while you stood there the entire time being someone else entirely." "I was not being someone else," he said, low and urgent, as the riders reined in at the gate. "I have never in my life been more myself than I have been these past weeks in your garden, Wren. I swear it to you, but there was no time for more, because the riders had dismounted, and the elder of them, a hard-faced man in a travelling coat too fine for country roads, was already striding toward them with an expression of grim, relieved purpose. "My lord," the man said, bowing stiffly to Gabriel. "Thank God. We have searched 3 counties for you. Your uncle has grown bold in your absence. There is a matter of the will, and witnesses paid to swear you dead, and I fear if we do not return you to London within the week, the damage may not be undoable." Gabriel's face had gone hard and remote in the space of a breath. The quiet, gentle man of the garden replaced by someone colder, more commanding, someone Wren did not recognize at all, and she felt the distance open between them like a physical thing, a chasm she had not seen coming until it was already beneath her feet. "I will come," Gabriel said, "but not this hour. I have matters here to settle first." "My lord, there is no time. I said I will come," Gabriel repeated, and something in his voice made the man fall silent at once. A note of authority Wren had never heard from him before, and it struck her, with a fresh sick jolt, exactly how little of him she truly knew. "Wait for me at the inn. I will follow within the hour." The men withdrew, though reluctantly, and when they had gone, Gabriel turned back to Wren, and whatever he saw in her face made him reach for her, though she stepped back before his hand could close around hers. "Don't," she said. "Please, I need a moment, Gabriel, my lord. Whatever I am meant to call you now, Wren." "You let me believe you were a man with nothing," she said. And now the tears she had been holding back broke loose despite her, hot and furious. "A man with nothing, like me. I told you things I have never told another living soul. I let myself hope, God help me, I let myself hope that a man with nothing might look at a woman with nothing and see something worth wanting. And the entire time you were a viscount, playing at poverty in my garden. And I do not know if any of it was real, or if I was simply an amusement, a curiosity, a way to pass the time while you hid from whatever it is you were hiding from." "It was real," he said, and his voice cracked on the words in a way that startled her. This composed, careful man suddenly raw with feeling. "Every hour of it was real. I did not come to your garden seeking amusement, Wren. I came seeking safety. And I found something I did not know I was still capable of finding, which was a home. You gave me that. Not the cottage, you. I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from my title, my land, my name, and you wanted nothing from me but honest work and honest company. And I have never in my life felt more valued for so little reason and so much heart." Pretty words, she said, though something in her chest ached at them despite herself, from a man who is leaving within the hour. "I must go," he said, "because if I do not, my uncle will finish what his hired blade started in that ditch, and there will be no one left to return to you at all. But I am not leaving you, Wren. I am asking you to trust me a little longer, though I know I have given you every reason not to." She said nothing, because she did not trust her own voice, and after a long, aching moment, he stepped back, bowed to her with a formality that felt like a wound in itself, and walked away down the lane toward the waiting men, leaving her standing alone in the garden they had tended together, surrounded by rows of vegetables planted by a man who was, she now understood, entirely beyond her reach. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Wren's life, harder even than the early days of her father's illness, because grief for the dying carries its own strange comfort, the knowledge that love given freely is never wasted, while this grief carried only confusion, the sick uncertainty of not knowing whether she had loved a real man or an elaborate performance, whether the tenderness in his eyes had been genuine, or simply the practiced charm of a nobleman accustomed to getting whatever he wanted from whomever he wanted it. Squire Pruitt pressed his advantage in Gabriel's absence, riding to the cottage twice in a fortnight to remind her, with increasing bluntness, that the debt on the cottage came due at the quarter's end, and that Edmund remained, in his words, a generous and forgiving option for a woman in her position. Her father's cough worsened with the damp autumn weather, and twice she sat up through the night listening to him struggle for breath, terror closing cold fingers around her heart, and through it all she found herself, despite everything, watching the lane, some foolish, stubborn part of her still hoping to see a familiar figure walking toward the gate. He did not come. Word reached the village instead, carried on the tongues of travellers and the pages of a month-old London paper that found its way to the draper's shop, of Viscount Ashworth's dramatic return to society, his uncle's schemes exposed and disgraced, The old earls will read and upheld in Gabriel's favour. And beneath that news, whispered with the particular relish villagers, reserved for gossip about their betters, word of a match being arranged for the young Viscount, a Lady Cordelia Fenwick, daughter of an earl, beautiful and well-connected, precisely the sort of bride a man of Gabriel's restored standing was expected to choose. Wren read the notice 3 times before she set the paper down, and told herself, with the same firm, useless resolve she had used on the coin so many weeks ago, that she felt nothing at all. Edmund Pruitt himself came to call not long after the notice appeared, standing awkwardly at her gate with his hat turned over in his hands, and though he lacked his father's sharp edges, there was a doggedness in him that afternoon that Wren found harder to refuse than she expected. "I know you fancied yourself in love with that stranger," he said, with more bluntness than tact, "and I know it can't have ended well, else he'd not have gone off to marry an earl's daughter. I'm not offering you grand feeling, Wren. I never have and I never will. I haven't the gift for it. But I'd not treat you unkindly, and you'd want for nothing, and your father would have a roof secure for the whole of his days, rather than one hanging on my own father's temper. Think on it. That's all I ask." She did think on it, more than she wished to, lying awake that night turning the offer over in her mind with the same grim practicality her aunt had long urged upon her. It was, by any sensible measure, the safer path security purchased at the cost of a passion she had already been taught, rather brutally, could not be trusted to last. But every time she tried to picture herself accepting it, tried to imagine a lifetime of quiet, dutiful contentment, beside a man she did not love, some stubborn, aching part of her rebelled against the picture entirely, and she understood, with a kind of weary clarity, that whatever else Gabriel's deception had cost her, it had also ruined her, gently and irrevocably, for any life built on resignation alone. She was still telling herself this, unconvincingly, when her Aunt Prudence arrived one grey afternoon with news of her own, delivered with the particular satisfaction of a woman who believed herself vindicated. "The squire has grown impatient," Prudence said, settling into her chair without being asked. "He means to call the debt due at the quarter's end regardless of what you decide about Edmund. Wren, and if you cannot pay it, he will have the cottage, and you and your father will have nowhere to go. I have told you before that resignation is a skill worth learning. I tell you again now, with rather more urgency." "I have 3 weeks yet," Wren said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "I will find a way. With what money? What connections? You have spent the autumn mooning over a viscount who has already forgotten your existence in favour of an earl's daughter, and now you find yourself with a debt come due, and no prospects but the one standing directly in front of you. Marry Edmund, Wren. It will not be a grand life, but it will be a roof, and food, and safety for your father, and those are not small things to a woman in your position." Wren said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not sound, to her aunt's practical ears, like foolish sentiment. But that night, lying awake and listening to her father's laboured breathing through the wall, she allowed herself, for the first time since Gabriel had walked away down the lane, to weep fully and without restraint, mourning not only the loss of him, but the loss of the version of her own life she had briefly, foolishly allowed herself to imagine. One where a plain, poor woman might be loved simply for herself, and not merely tolerated for her usefulness. She woke the next morning with her eyes swollen, and her resolve, strangely, restored. She would not marry Edmund Pruitt out of fear. She would find another way, some way, even if she could not yet see its shape, because she had spent too many years being told what she must resign herself to, and something in her, some stubborn ember Gabriel's brief presence, had fanned back to life, refused to be extinguished so easily now. What Wren did not know, in those long weeks of doubt, was that Gabriel's own days in London were consumed by a battle every bit as bruising as her own, though fought with solicitors and ledgers, rather than debts and desperate suitors. His uncle, cornered at last by evidence Gabriel had spent the autumn quietly gathering through allies he did trust, fought the accusation with every weapon a wealthy, well-connected man could summon, spreading rumour that his nephew had fled London not from danger but from cowardice, or worse, from some disgrace he dared not name, and for a fortnight it seemed entirely possible that the old Earl, weakened and easily confused in his final illness, might be persuaded to believe it. It was in the middle of that fortnight that Lady Cordelia Fenwick's father first raised the question of a match, not out of any wish of his daughter's, Gabriel would learn later, but out of calculation entirely his own, a bid to align his family with whichever side of the inheritance dispute proved victorious. Gabriel refused the suggestion outright, more than once. In terms he hoped left no room for misunderstanding, but a refusal delivered privately in a solicitor's office had no power to outrun a rumour already loosed among London's drawing rooms, and by the time the notice reached the pages of a country paper weeks later, it had travelled through enough careless mouths to harden into something that read, to anyone unfamiliar with its origin, very much like settled fact. He thought of Wren constantly through those weeks, more than he let himself admit even in his own private thoughts, turning over in his mind the particular steadiness of her hands as she'd cleaned his wound that first night, the dry humour with which she'd met his evasions, the fierce, unadorned dignity with which she'd spoken of Squire Pruitt's designs upon her, as though describing weather rather than a threat to the whole shape of her future. He wrote to her twice before the letter she eventually received, and tore up both attempts, dissatisfied, telling himself the words did not yet do justice to what he owed her, though in truth he admitted to himself only very late one sleepless night. He was afraid, plainly and simply afraid, that the woman who had loved a penniless labourer might want nothing at all to do with the Viscount that labourer had turned out to be, and that fear had cost him precious weeks he could not now recover. It was his grandfather of all people, frail and fading but sharper than his failing body suggested, who finally pushed him toward honesty. "You have the look," the old Earl said, from his sickbed, watching his grandson pace the length of the chamber for the better part of an hour, of a man arguing with himself and losing. "I have seen that look before, on my own face, 40 years gone, the night before I nearly let your grandmother marry another man, out of nothing more than cowardice, dressed up as prudence. Do not make my error twice in one family, Gabriel. Write to her. Tell her all of it. A woman who tended a stranger's wound without knowing what he was worth to her has already shown you more courage than half the drawing rooms of London combined. Match it, or you will spend the rest of your days regretting that you did not." Gabriel wrote the letter that same night, and did not tear it up. The letter arrived 4 days later, carried by a rider in fine livery, who caused a considerable stir in the village simply by passing through it, and it was addressed, to Wren's astonishment, to her. She opened it with trembling hands, and found Gabriel's careful, educated script filling 2 full pages, and she read it standing in the lane, heedless of the cold, heedless of everything but the words in front of her. "Wren, I have begun this letter a dozen times and abandoned it a dozen more, because I find I do not know how to write to you without either saying too little or too much. And I have decided, at last, that too much is the better failing. So I will simply tell you the truth, all of it, as I should have told you weeks ago in your garden, and let you judge me by it as you see fit. My uncle arranged the attack that sent me bleeding into your ditch. He hired a man to threaten me, to frighten me from London long enough to forge a claim upon my grandfather's estate before the old man's death made the inheritance final. And I fled not from cowardice, but because I had no proof of his treachery, and no allies I trusted enough to protect me while I gathered it. I did not seek you out, Wren. I stumbled into your care, by accident, by storm, by whatever grace exists in this world that sometimes delivers a desperate man to exactly the doorstep he most needs. But I stayed by choice. Every day I remained in your garden, splitting your kindling badly and reading to your father, and falling more completely in love with you than I have ever been with anything in my life. That was choice, freely made, and I do not regret a single hour of it. Whatever confusion or pain my leaving may have caused you, the notice of my betrothal to Lady Cordelia is a lie, or rather it is my uncle's last desperate manoeuvre, an arrangement he pressed upon the Earl before his schemes were fully exposed, one I have already refused in the strongest possible terms, and which the Earl himself, once he understood the truth of my uncle's treachery, was glad enough to abandon. I do not know how the notice found its way to your village paper, save that gossip travels faster and less accurately than truth generally manages, but I could not bear the thought of you reading it and believing, even for a single hour, that I had chosen another. I am asking you, Wren, with more honesty than I have ever managed with anyone in my life, to allow me to come to you properly, not as a wounded stranger seeking shelter, and not as a viscount seeking to rescue a poor woman from her circumstances, because I know you well enough now to understand you would never forgive being rescued, only loved as an equal. I am asking to come to you as a man who wishes to marry the woman who bandaged his hand and mended, in the same unassuming motion. Something in him he had long believed beyond mending. If you will have me, send word by the rider who carries this letter, and I will come within the week. If you will not, I will trouble you no further, though I will carry the memory of your garden and your fierce, unbending kindness for the whole of my life, wherever it takes me. Yours, in every truth I know how to tell, Gabriel. Wren read the letter twice more before she trusted her hands enough to fold it, and stood a long while in the cold lane, with her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat, torn between the wild, soaring hope the letter had kindled and the cautious, well-earned fear that hope of this kind had a way of costing more than it gave. It was her father, when she finally showed him the letter that evening, who settled the matter. "You have spent 3 years," he said, his voice thin but steady, "caring for me, managing debts not of your making, refusing every small comfort for yourself, so that I might have what little comfort remained to me. I have watched you become old before your time, Wren, and it has been the great sorrow of my illness, greater even than the illness itself, to watch it happen and be powerless to stop it. Do not, I beg you, let fear rob you of this now. Whatever else that man is or was, he wrote 3 pages by his own hand to a poor cottage in Thornbury Hollow, rather than simply forgetting you as convenience would have allowed. That is not nothing. That is, I think, rather a great deal. She sent word by the rider that same night, 3 words only, because she found she did not trust herself to write more without weeping onto the page. Come, I forgive. He arrived 5 days later, not in fine travelling coach as she had half expected, but on foot, walking up the lower lane exactly as he had the day he first asked for work in her garden. Though this time he wore the unmistakable bearing of a man restored to his proper place in the world, and behind him, at a respectful distance, waited a small retinue that made it plain, even to the village gossips watching from behind their curtains, that the man walking toward the Hollis cottage was no common traveller. Wren met him at the gate, her heart in her throat, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply looked at each other across the small distance that had come to feel, in the weeks of his absence, like the whole of an ocean. "I owe you an apology," he said at last, "for the manner of my leaving. If not for the necessity of it, I should have told you the truth from the first night, storm or no storm, wound or no wound. I told myself I was protecting you by keeping silent, but I think, in truth, I was protecting myself. because I had spent my whole life being wanted for my title, and I was terrified, once I understood what I felt for you, of discovering that the same would prove true here. That the moment you learned what I was, the woman who saw me so plainly would vanish, and leave only calculation in her place. I am not the sort of woman who calculates, Wren said, though her voice trembled with the effort of holding steady. I know that now, he said. I think, in my heart, I knew it even then. But knowing a thing, and trusting it enough to risk everything upon it, are not always the same, and I am ashamed it took me so long to close that distance. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the healed line of the scar across his palm, the mark her own hands had tended in a storm that felt now like a lifetime ago. I have come to answer for Squire Pruitt's debt, if you will permit it, not as rescue but as restitution. The cottage roof he financed was mended in part with wood I split myself, badly, under your instruction, and I find I have some claim upon its condition. And I have come to ask you properly, before your father, and before whatever portion of this village cares to watch, whether you will marry a man who has very little to offer you beyond a title he never wanted, land he is only now learning to love honestly, and a heart that has belonged to you, without his full understanding of it, since the night you knelt in a ditch and decided a stranger's wound was worth the risk of your own safety. Wren felt the tears come before she could stop them, though these, unlike the ones she had wept alone in the dark these past weeks, came from somewhere entirely different, some deep well of relief and disbelief, and hope finally, cautiously, allowed to bloom. You are asking a poor apothecary's daughter to become a viscountess, she said. You understand how absurd that sounds, spoken aloud in a garden gone to seed. I am asking the woman who taught me the honest satisfaction of a split log and a weeded row to teach me. For the rest of my life, whatever else I have forgotten how to value, simply for its own sake, he said. The title is incidental, Wren. It was never the title that healed anything in me. It was you. She did not answer him in words. She answered him by closing the small distance between them and letting him fold her into an embrace that felt, after all the weeks of doubt and grief, entirely, undeniably like coming home. And behind them, in the cottage doorway, her father watched with tears of his own sliding unashamed down his weathered face, and further off, at the garden gate, Prudence stood with her mouth open in an expression of such thorough astonishment that Wren, catching sight of her over Gabriel's shoulder, laughed aloud despite herself, a bright, unguarded sound she had not made in longer than she could remember. Squire Pruitt's reaction, when word reached him of the Viscount's intentions toward the woman he had meant to secure for his son, was considerably less charming, and he rode to the cottage the following morning in a state of blustering outrage, demanding to know by what right a stranger presumed to interfere in a debt lawfully owed and a match long understood between families. The debt, Gabriel informed him, with a cool, unhurried authority that made the squire's bluster falter almost at once, will be settled in full within the hour, by my own solicitor, who is even now drawing the papers in the village. As for the match you claim was understood, I would ask you to produce the lady's consent to it, since I have heard, from her own mouth, no such consent was ever given, only pressure applied by a man who mistook a woman's desperate circumstances for genuine willingness. You have no standing to interfere in the affairs of this village, Pruitt sputtered. I have precisely the standing my title affords me, Gabriel said, which I have used sparingly in my life, and mean to use rather more freely from this day forward, beginning with the protection of a woman I intend to marry. I would advise you, Squire Pruitt, to consider carefully whether you wish to make an enemy of a man with resources considerably beyond your own, over a debt that will shortly no longer exist to argue about at all. The squire left considerably chastened, and did not trouble the Hollis cottage again, and Edmund Pruitt, it was later reported through the village grapevine, with no small amount of satisfaction. expressed relief rather more than disappointment at the collapse of the arrangement, having harbored, it seemed, no great enthusiasm for the match himself. The wedding, when it came at the turn of the new year, was a smaller affair than Gabriel's standing might have demanded, held in the small stone chapel at Thornbury Hollow, rather than in any grand London church. Because Wren had asked for that much, and Gabriel, who had learned by then the particular value of things chosen honestly over things dictated by convention, had granted it without hesitation. Her father, whose health had improved considerably once proper physicians and proper medicines were finally within reach, stood to give her away with tears streaming freely down his face, and Prudence, for once in her life entirely without a sharp word to offer, wept openly into a handkerchief throughout the whole of the ceremony. Gabriel's own family attended in modest number, his grandfather too frail to travel, but sending his blessing by letter, his disgraced uncle absent entirely, his crimes now thoroughly exposed, and his claims upon the estate permanently forfeit. Lady Cordelia Fenwick, whom rumour had once wrongly promised to Gabriel, sent a gracious note of congratulation instead, having found in the intervening months an attachment of her own considerably better suited to her temperament, a fact that amused Gabriel greatly when he read it aloud to Wren, both of them laughing at how thoroughly the village gossip mill had spun an entire false engagement, from nothing more than a frightened old man's desperate scheming. Standing before the small altar in the chapel where she had been christened, dressed in a gown far simpler than any London bride would have worn but which felt, to Wren, like the finest thing she had ever owned, she looked at Gabriel Ashworth, Viscount and, before that, before anything else, the quiet stranger who had let her bandage his wounded hand without once trying to hide the truth of his pain from her, and understood that every hard year that had come before this moment, every debt and every fear, and every night spent doubting her own worth, had led her here, to a love that asked nothing of her but herself. Plainly and completely, exactly as she was. "I once told you," she whispered to him, as the priest prepared to speak the final words that would bind them, "that I had bandaged worse than your hand. I did not know, that night, that I was bandaging the whole of my future alongside it. And I once told you," Gabriel murmured back, his grey eyes bright with a happiness that had nothing guarded left in it at all, "that I was between destinations. I have found mine, Wren. I found it in your garden, weeks before I understood what I was finding, and I mean to spend the whole of my life grateful I stumbled into that ditch on the one night a woman brave enough, and kind enough, and honest enough to save me, happened to be walking that lane." The chapel bells rang out over Thornbury Hollow that afternoon, carrying across the fields and the hedgerows and the lower lane where a storm had once delivered a wounded stranger to exactly the doorstep he needed, and in the small stone building beneath them, a plain apothecary's daughter and a viscount who had learned the true worth of an honest day's labour were joined at last, not as lord and commoner, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two people who had found, in each other, precisely what neither had known to hope for, and had chosen, against every obstacle placed between them, to keep it.